Welcome to Run the Adventure, a podcast about getting the most out of published modules for your tabletop role-playing game. I'm your host, Sid Razavi. Every episode, I take a look at a module to show you where the fun is and how you might want to tweak it to suit your game. I hope even if you decide not to play this particular adventure, you will get some interesting ideas out of it. The following content is aimed at games masters or players who want to be games masters. So if this is a module you are going to play, then this is the point when you should tell your GM about it and turn it off. But if you're ready to step behind the screen, then there is no better time than to start right now. I've been running games for over 30 years, but my aim with every episode is to put myself in the shoes of a new GM. As well as breaking down the scenario and how it plays, I'll be peppering the discussion with useful advice for the relatively new GM who has to try to run this for their group. I hope the discussion will also prove interesting for veteran GMs who are looking for ideas for their own games as well. Okay, now all that said, let's get to this episode's adventure. For this episode, I embark on the Achtung Cthulhu adventure, A Quick Trip to France. This was provided in the Quick Start rules for the 2D20 version of Achtung Cthulhu. The setting predates its recent conversion to Modiphius' 2D20 system, having previously been available for Call of Cthulhu, Fate, Savage Worlds, and Trail of Cthulhu. It's a setting about fighting the Axis powers in a secret war during the Second World War, involving, as you might suspect, Cthulhu Mythos entities, magic, and weird science. In short, it's pulp adventures in wartime with a bit of horror fantasy thrown in. The 2D20 system isn't for everyone, and Modiphius has gotten some flack for the editorial quality of their rulebooks. So whilst I'll be focusing on the scenario in the Quick Start rules as it stands, I will be discussing how it works as an introduction to the 2D20 rules as well. However, GMs wanting to lift the adventure for other systems will find an enjoyable romp through wartime France to play with.
Summary of the adventure.
The Black Sun, one of the occult forces of the Nazi regime, have occupied the French village of Saint-Sulac. Local resistance leader, Aramis, manages to get a message out that is picked up by Section M, the special wartime department of the British military that deals with the secret war. Wanting to know what the Black Sun want in a small rural village in France, they gather some of their best agents and send them to Saint-Sulac. The agents paradrop down into the nearby countryside and make their stealthy way towards the village. There they are to meet Aramis and what remains of his resistance cell. After coded greetings are exchanged, the agents discover that the Black Sun have holed up and fortified the local chateau. Fixed gun positions have been placed as sentries, and troopers patrol the area, making a direct assault suicidal. Worse news is they seem to be rounding up the villagers and taking them into the chateau itself. For what nefarious purpose? Aramis doesn't know. Lucky for the agents, there is another way in via the old caves beneath the chateau. The agents get a whole lot of foreboding from the strange weather and sick livestock as they perform reconnaissance in the village. In fact, those with a bent for the occult will sense that some dark ritual is being cast somewhere nearby. When they finally get to the barn where the entrance to the old tunnels are located, they find a squad of Black Sun troopers searching for resistance members. A firefight ensues, and once the Black Sun troopers are defeated, the agents have to get the old truck that sits atop the entrance repaired and moved. Then they can clamber down to the tunnels and find an unguarded way into the chateau. Creeping up from the basement, the agents discover the Black Sun sorcerer Jan Stoller performing a summoning ritual with the poor villagers used as human sacrifices. By the time the heroes get there, a servitor of Nyarlathotep has already manifested. The party must defeat the Black Sun troopers and novice sorcerers and put an end to the ritual. This is challenging as reinforcements are only a call away from the chateau above. but the heroes have no choice if they want to stop a great evil being unleashed on the world.
Adventure structure.
The mission is presented in a single act consisting of 4 scenes. To begin with, though, an introduction and story synopsis is given, placing the scenario in the early stages of the Secret War, a little after Dunkirk and just before the Battle of Britain. As this mission appears as the third and final part of the Quick Start rules, GMs will have had a decent grounding in the rules and setting before getting to this point. Still, there is very little hand-holding given about what it takes to run an Achtung Cthulhu scenario in the Quick Start rules, or how its structure may be laid out. This puts the onus on getting the presentation of the scenes right, so they bring the GM and players up to speed gradually. The first scene is the parachute drop. We do get a brief introduction to the mission in the form of a longish read-aloud text that provides the briefing from Section M. But the scene starts on board the plane with the agents about to jump into occupied France. The first thing players will have to do is a skill check, and this is a good opportunity to introduce them to one of the meta currencies of the 2D20 system, momentum. Building momentum is what skilled player characters do when they get more successes than is necessary to pass a test. Skill tests involve rolling 2 or more d20s. A success is gained by getting equal or less than a target number formed by summing a characteristic and a skill together. Roll low enough doing something you're particularly good at, the focus of the skill, or anytime you roll a natural 1 and you get a critical success, which counts as 2 successes. Sometimes rolling any number of successes at all means building up momentum, as the difficulty for a check may be reduced to 0 by circumstances. For example, in the first scene, one of the pregens is an experienced commando, and this truth about them reduces the difficulty of the task from 1 to 0. Then, less capable characters may spend momentum to increase their odds by buying additional d20s to perform the task. Rolling 20s on a test results in complications, which in the first scene may mean getting tangled up in a tree or landing some distance off the target. Once the agents have got their boots on the ground, they must navigate their way to the village itself. This means another skill test and an opportunity to show off the rules for assisting one lead character in a task by making a half test yourself, i.e. using 1 d20 instead of 2. Players can also be encouraged to buy more dice on this crucial test using momentum, or by paying for it using threat. Threat is the second meta-currency the system uses. Threat is in many ways for the GM what momentum is for the players, a way to buy more dice for checks or create certain truths about the scene. However, threat can also be used to spice things up in a lot of different ways, such as calling for a spot patrol or reinforcements. The final part of the first scene involves the agents getting a sense of the strange and occult going on in Saint-Sulac. In other words, this is a chance for the more academic and occult members of the group to shine after the spotlight shifts from the physically adept and those with survival skill. The first scene does a lot of work in an easygoing manner to introduce the players to the system with skill checks, meta currencies, and a bit of the occult thematics thrown in. Plus, it's a very cool way to start an adventure with the agents jumping out of a plane. It definitely feels like you're playing a pulp adventure set in World War II. The second scene is as close to an investigation element this scenario provides, as the player characters perform reconnaissance in the village and try to find the resistance leader Aramis. There is a brief NPC encounter available with a farmer trying to get their cattle out of harm's way after the Black Sun started raiding and burning farmsteads suspected of harboring the resistance. Whilst talking to NPCs and looking around can uncover clues, Achtung Cthulhu can short-circuit much of this process by allowing players to spend momentum to buy clues. It will take some figuring out how to effectively narrate this mechanic, but for those more comfortable with storytelling style games rather than simulationist style games, it shouldn't be too difficult. With the farmer's help, the agents will then head to where Aramis is located. This will require some stealth checks and navigating past German patrols. Once they arrive at the farm, the agents will have to determine which building Aramis is located in with a bit of observation or taking the direct approach of knocking on doors, throwing caution to the wind. Once found, the wounded resistance leader will offer the agents the information necessary to plan the only viable approach to the chateau after he's impressed upon them the risks of a direct approach and the necessity of intervening in whatever evil plot the Black Sun have in store for the locals. The third scene begins by introducing a new game element, truths for scenes. Truths are descriptive tags that characters have that give a broad remit of things that they are particularly good at. This makes the difficulty of skill checks lower for them, or conversely, makes skill checks against them more difficult. For example, an experienced commando is good at parachuting out of a plane or other commando-ish activities. But it also applies to speaking your own native language or understanding cultural idioms of your nationality. It's a decent way of giving a bit of free-form specialization that doesn't have to fit neatly into one of the skills available, but may apply to a number of different situations. Truth can also be applied to scenes to make some skill checks easier and others harder. In the third scene, the stormy weather truth is applied, making stealth checks easier, but making observation or shooting at range more difficult. This means the agents have a decent chance of sneaking around the village to the barn where they need to go. Once they get there, a set-piece battle against a number of Black Sun troopers awaits. Having vanquished their foe, the agents have to repair and move the truck that's blocking the entrance to the caves beneath the chateau. This is another skill check. This leads to the final scene. The player characters have to navigate the tunnels beneath, succeeding at a rather difficult challenge to make good time. Otherwise, they will pick up a bit of stress on the way. Stress is the main damage track of Achtung Cthulhu. It represents both physical and mental damage. Each character has a finite amount they can take depending on either their physical or mental strength. Once they hit their maximum or take a lot in one go, they will acquire an injury. While stress disappears at the end of a scene, injuries take treatment or time to be dealt with. Sometimes injuries lead to truths such as scars or disabilities. This does mean in most cases, player characters are fairly good at getting back up to full strength with each new scene in a suitably Pulp Fiction manner. Once the agents have found their way to the basement of the chateau, they find the summoning ritual in full swing, and they will have an opportunity to get the lay of the land and plan their approach if they wish. Or they may jump in half-cocked and see where things go. It depends on the temperament of your group. Both ways are fine ways to have fun. The battle is hard, especially if the GM has been storing up threat points for calling in reinforcements. One thing the quick start rules don't give is the ability in the core rules to group NPCs so they can be fought as a block of, say, 3 or 4 or whatever number you feel makes sense. This will certainly speed up the rounds of the battle. Playing by the quick start rules, each trooper will act individually, and this will mean the battle will take some time as you bring in wave after wave of reinforcements. That is, if you're doing it right. Of course, killing the mooks is not the point of the scene at all. What the agents have to do, and will be looking for if they are observant about it, is a way to stop the ritual. This is rather trivial once they work it out, requiring the agents to destroy, close, or otherwise interfere with the ritual book sitting on the podium next to the Black Sun Master. Once this is done, the sorcerer will make a hasty retreat, if he can. After his death or escape, the remaining troopers can be mopped up with a sweeping epilogue with the villagers saved and the heroes returned to good old Blighty.
Where the fun is at.
The scenario is two-fisted fun for those who like the idea of shooting up some Nazis, a staple of guilt-free murder hoboing in RPGs. It starts strong with the agents doing something heroic by jumping out of a plane, and ends with them saving the world from Nyarlathotep and the evil Nazi cult leader who wants to summon him. I'm sure not every listener is into the kind of boy's own adventure. Oh, let's face it, there's no nuance here. The baddies are really bad, the goodies may be dirty and not play by the book, or in the case of my particular party, get all the village hostages killed, but they're not going to cry about it afterwards. Stiff upper lip and all that. If you're in the mood for Cthulhu Mythos mixed in with your classic World War II film from the 50s and 60s, before the movies try to show you war is hell, then this is for you. The action sequences work really well, even as they serve as a learning tool. The rules do get more foreground than I would normally like, but it doesn't feel forced. It's a simple enough system, and for simulating the swings of fortune, the meta currencies work really well. Momentum nicely captures how a competent leader can make all the troops underneath them achieve difficult tasks. When things are going well, it plays out as you might expect, with everybody getting an upswing for things to go even better. And when your luck runs out, everything comes crashing down and becomes dangerously grounded. The threat mechanics also give GMs an explicit way to measure out the tension and difficulty. It does require a bit of buy-in from the players to cash in some threat to get their successes now and deal with the fallout later. But players who want to make the story larger than life with more dramatically impossible odds to overcome will love the system. The scenario is on the shorter side of those published by Modiphius for their 2D20 game, but it will take a couple of sessions to get through as you are teaching new players along the way. On that score, I think it does a really good job of presenting rules in a staggered fashion that is easy to absorb. I think the only bit I struggled with myself was the summoning ritual and its stress track. The last scene with the various spellcasting NPCs was a challenge to get right, but ultimately it didn't matter too much as there's plenty going on and the players felt the tension just fine.
What doesn't work?
There's very little I can say that didn't work on the 2 nights we played this, and what I may do differently would be more to do with how I might emphasize different aspects of gameplay. For example, I think I might enjoy extending the second scene's reconnaissance and investigation to reveal more about the Black Sun's plan organically, rather than having Aramis drop the details in return for momentum spends. However, I appreciate that is not the game's focus, and it would slow down the action. My players may in fact prefer more fights than scouting. The scenario is intended to play out with hard cuts from one momentous scene to another, rather than the slow, investigative preparations found in some Call of Cthulhu games. Still, the option is there, I think, to have the PCs spend more time in Sans-Souci and have a few more running fights if the GM and the players want to extend playtime to, say, 3 sessions. I suspect the final battle would take a long time to resolve without the optional grouping of NPCs from the core rules. As written, I think the climactic fight might be very slow going if your players don't cut to the chase and destroy the Black Sun Master's spellbook quickly. You will probably have to suggest the insight and occultism check that reveals this clue to the players unless they are particularly proactive about it. On a similar vein, the Quick Start rules are not very clear about how ritual magic works or how the Black Sun makes progress towards completing the ritual. The little box on the specific ritual seems to assume you've seen the ritual spellcasting rules in the core rulebook. The text does describe how Stolar, the Black Sun Master, will focus on completing the ritual and details the mechanics he will use, but I had to read the core rulebook to get a real grip on how ritual magic works. Someone just picking up the Quick Start rules will probably struggle with these elements and a few other nuances. I think this is where I have to add my voice of complaint about whoever does the editing on the 2D20 line of books for making their rule books and supplements some of the most difficult to use in my collection of modern RPGs. Contradictory rules that are spread around everywhere are a common gripe. But once you get past these presentation flaws, the system is, I think, quite good at capturing the kind of action that this scenario and setting offers. I guess some players may be allergic to the use of group meta currencies or narrative control of the world being punted back to them, preferring to focus on their own individual characters. I'm sympathetic to this, but I do think it works well to build larger-than-life outcomes that are fueled more by player imagination and teamwork than the constraints of the world put in place by the GM.
Make it your own.
Now, I can't say I have played every system, or indeed most of the systems, that have been used to play Achtung Cthulhu in the past, but I think there's very little here that would prevent you taking this scenario and playing it using some other rule set if you wanted to. I do have the Achtung Cthulhu for 7th edition Call of Cthulhu rules, and there's enough tools in that to see how a pulpy Call of Cthulhu might work very well in running a scenario like this. Of course, a lot of what this scenario is about is easing players into the rule set by introducing them gradually to different elements. Removing this removes some of the rationale for various scene elements. Skill checks have an equivalent in many systems, including Call of Cthulhu. Scene truths could be turned to environmental penalties or bonuses for skill checks, and momentum buys for obtaining clues could be left to skill checks alone. The narrative would not be harmed by these changes, and there's probably enough of a story here worth playing for its own sake. The open question is, what does this introductory scenario tell the GM about what an Achtung Cthulhu adventure should be like? I think starter sets and quick start rules are best placed to set expectations out clearly, and where they fail is often in presenting a different game than the ones the rules are typically used to play. This is not a failing for this scenario. It provides a somewhat condensed playthrough of what many of the published adventures for the setting seem to provide. It works as a good guide for GMs wishing to write their own and how to structure their own adventures. This can be broken down to 4 key sections: the mission briefing, reconnaissance, escalation, and confrontation. The mission briefing is where the agents get told which Nazi cult is causing trouble and where. In the case of A Quick Trip to France, this is nicely combined with an immediate insertion into the field. In other scenarios, this gets expanded out with travel elements and briefing meetings, plus handouts. But the objective is the same: to get the players on the hook to go where the action is. The second section, reconnaissance, is what in many more investigation-type games would be a research or preparation component. Here, player characters spend less time in libraries or talking to local authorities than they do going behind enemy lines to find out where the baddies are and what they're up to. This section is a bit brief in this adventure, but its presence is notable and helps introduce one of the mechanics used in information gathering in 2D20 version of the game. The third section is the escalation, where the stakes are raised and obstacles towards the finale must be overcome. For the agents in this scenario, this is fighting the Black Sun troopers at the barn where the entrance of the tunnels is found. It's a gripping fight and gives them a definite sense of jeopardy. The final section is the confrontation with the Mythos and Nazi cult leaders. This is a big fight with magic thrown in. Notably, Achtung Cthulhu tends to keep the Mythos element to the end, which is reminiscent of other horror fantasy games such as Call of Cthulhu or Vaesen. This structure is good for writing your own Achtung Cthulhu scenarios in future. It's formulaic, but in the good way sometimes RPG scenarios should be. The uniqueness comes from player agency, not necessarily from the GM's wonderful ideas of how it should play out. You'd almost be able to write a few random tables to generate these elements. Of course, what the published scenarios do well is tie them in to the wider events of the war. This is the color or theme that makes the story interesting, and there's plenty of source material to work with. The unspoken rule with historical games in general, at least with official adventures for these settings, seems to be that you don't mess with the prime timeline. That said, I see nothing wrong if you want to Inglorious Bastards the death of the Führer in one of your own adventures.
how it played.
For this section, I'm joined by Ryan, who was one of the players in our Achtung Cthulhu playthrough of A Quick Trip to France from the Achtung Cthulhu Quick Start rules. Welcome, Ryan.
Hi.
So let's just jump right into it. What were the highlights of the scenario for you?
There's a few different ones. I wanted to try the 2D20 system again. I'd previously played it with some friends in a Conan game, and we'd sort of struggled a little bit with the rule set. There's a bit of sort of a debate online in regard to the sort of the meta currency that exists within Modiphius games. So I definitely wanted to that was one of the reasons, give it a second stab, as it were. I'd also not really played any Cthulhu games much before, which, yeah, it's a bit of a gap in sort of previous experience. I don't know why. I think when I started playing, which was about literally last century, just to sort of give away my age, 1988. I think it had come out a few years before that, so you kind of sort of played what your peers were playing. So we didn't play many Cthulhu games when I started playing, so that was another reason I wanted to play. I suppose, and also I quite enjoyed, I suppose, the final reason, pulp settings, that Indiana Jones type of game or setting. So that's why I fancy giving it a try.
And how did you find your second taster of this? Let's tackle it in two parts. The Modiphius kind of meta currency system that they have going on.
It was much better the second time around, as it were. I suppose it's like any other game. As you sort of play it a bit more, the rules fade into the background a little bit, and it becomes a bit more second nature. You're almost concentrating on two things: the sort of what's going on in the game, and also that slightly, I don't know if you describe it as strategic, but that sort of element of keeping an eye on, utilizing momentum and whether you've got it, and also buying it sometimes, the trade-off of sort of giving you threat, but actually will help you sort of potentially achieve a sort of an objective in the game. So it was good. I mean, we've played the second scenario with you, haven't we? And I found Foundry also helped loads to speed things up. I mean, that's a lot of extra work for you. But yeah, I enjoyed it. And the first session was still a bit of a struggle in terms of the rules, but second session, it just felt more natural. In terms of the scenario itself, I enjoyed it. I thought it was well constructed. It felt like it'd been reasonably well play tested. There wasn't anything glaring that stood out, both in terms of getting to grips with the system and the scenario itself. They both went well.
How do you think it played as a learning exercise? Because it's obviously part of the quick start rules, and so it's designed to help players get to grips with the system as well as the setting, etc. How do you think it played as in those rules?
Good, I think. I mean, I suppose the proof is in the pudding. That by second session, I felt reasonably comfortable with it all. More comfortable anyway. I still haven't quite wrapped my head around truths yet. I suppose a bit like our current Prime Minister, or our ex-Prime Minister, shortly to be. But that there's still a few elements I need to get my head around. But yeah, in that respect, I think it did work well. In terms of, because that's the whole point, is I suppose it's to introduce you to the setting and the rule set, isn't it? You obviously were very good and just set the tone at the end and just said, look, we're both sides of the fence, as it were. This is a learning experience for both of us, so it's just take it steady and enjoy ourselves, and I think that set the tone, and alongside what was a sort of a well-written introductory adventure.
Yeah, and I guess the second thing you mentioned was this was your first introduction to Cthulhu Mythos stuff. It's an interesting one because it doesn't have the horror elements. At least I don't think it plays that way, even though there are the same elements of horror because of the setting and the type of characters you play feels very different to when I play Call of Cthulhu, for example. How did you find it as an introduction?
Yeah, I mean, as you say, the pulp aspect sort of edges out a reasonable amount of, I suppose, the sort of the Cthulhu aspect. But I think the game did marry them well together, and I think you particularly saw that in the end scenario, I'm probably jumping ahead a little bit, which was sort of, in inverted commas, very Cthulhu, this sort of Black Sun sorcerer, magician, magic user, whatever you want to call him, was trying to summon, this sort of dark, sort of classic Cthulhu god creature type thing. And it was quite a tense finale when we're trying to sort of stop this summoning ceremony, but obviously being waylaid by soldiers and acolytes and such like. So that felt quite, it was a nice shift to sort of to be feeling a bit more what I expected to sort of. I mean, I've read the H.P. Lovecraft books, I've just never played the system much, and there were a couple of nice touches in the game where I think we hadn't been playing long when I think you had a bit of narrative you read out, isn't it, sort of describing this sort of this obviously dark magical wind sort of whatever sort of and that was again a good reminder of, yes, we're in a pulp game, but also it's a Cthulhu game, and helped sort of just begin to build a bit of atmosphere that rose nicely in the final sort of confrontation, as it were.
And okay, from the positive aspects of the introduction, what didn't you think worked so well?
To be honest, nothing hugely. It's a bit, I suppose. I'm not sure if I would call this a criticism. It's reasonably linear, I suppose. We land and we have to go to ultimately, to work our way to an end location. But I didn't. When I finished the game, I didn't. I mean, it was a hell of an ending, wasn't it? It was very Inglorious Bastards, wasn't it, at the end? And I've been thinking. Sorry, this is going. Yeah, slightly off topic from what you're saying. And no, I didn't. I didn't. Wouldn't change anything hugely. The point I was making is that at the end of it, I didn't think, oh well, I would have done that differently. I was thinking, oh, that was good. No, it. And again, I've been thinking about the ending. I certainly myself, I didn't know there was a part 2, and I do wonder if any of the other players knew there was a part 2, and if they did know there was a part 2, whether that would have changed the actions, as it were. But yeah, basically, one of the players, I mean, I suppose they had a hand in it because I handed him these explosive charges. Decided to, I suppose, sacrifice himself in a sense, isn't it? To basically sort of charged towards this sort of magic user who's getting, I suppose, quite close to finishing his summoning ceremony. And I think he took these explosive charges, sort of literally placed them against this particular summon. And I can't remember, and did he shoot them or sort of basically some action to ignite them in the end, wasn't it? It was pretty sort of fast and furious towards the end. And I'm trying to think how he ignited them. I mean, I think when the designers included the charges, I don't think they had in mind that they were going to sort of be sort of placed against the big bad at the end to interrupt this ceremony. I think, we sort of blew up the I suppose the cavern, isn't it? That was under this chateau. In theory, I suppose we would have blown ourselves up and anyone else. And I think there were a few civilian deaths as well from memory. It was a hell of an ending. Literally a metaphorically an explosive ending, straight out of the end scene from Inglorious Bastards. And I don't know whether I've just sort of wondered, mused whether whether they, we knew there was a part 2 or not, whether that might have altered actions towards the end. Were you expecting that towards the end from a sort of a GM perspective?
I'm always surprised by what players decide to do, and especially when you give a one shot and a kind of a Nazi pulpy thing. It seemed a little unnecessary, but it seemed a bit unnecessary. But that's fine.
It was an experience, if nothing else. Yeah, I suppose you're at that point now where you're not surprised at all by anything players do anymore.
I'm going to ask the next question, but it feels like we've already answered it to some extent. Did you feel the outcome was in your hands? Could you see it ending differently, as it were?
Yeah, I mean, I did feel the outcome was in our hands. I thought the sort of the pitch, the design of the pre-gens was good. I felt that we could influence the game, but equally we weren't too overpowered. And I think I've obviously touched on it earlier that whether we knew there was a part 2 would have influenced decisions differently. But I imagine you could run that game and have I think if we did it again, that there would be a different outcome than the one we the one we chose.
from my point of view, whilst I was aware that there was a sequel, it was up in the air whether we would play the sequel. I'd run one other Achtung Cthulhu game, either before or just after. So it was very much the same kind of vein, getting to know the system, see if it's fun to play. And I think after our playthrough, particularly of a quick trip to France, I was quite keen to play more. I could see the appeal of it. So, what did you think of the tone of the adventure? Did it hit the right tone for you?
It felt very sort of World War II-y, as it were, in inverted commas. And I suppose, the characters are very much influenced by the SOE, isn't it? The sort of the Special Operations Executive who sort of carried out sort of clandestine missions on sort of the European mainland during World War II. And I suppose we're the sort of almost supernatural equivalent of that. So I think it married everything nicely together. You had that sort of World War II element. You had that sort of pulpy element as well. Also, the sort of, the Cthulhu part as well. I think it had to sort of juggle those three things and sort of draw them together. And it did. I mean, arriving in France, the typical French village, the chateau, it just felt like a sort of a World War II scenario, but also, sort of the magic element and just, I think, again, I touched on it earlier, the sort of little things like that sort of, the wind and the sort of sense of foreboding that I suppose, I've not played much Cthulhu, but I think is fairly integral to it. I think it seemed to be a well thought out, well designed, scenario, sort of pulling these different sort of fairly disparate elements together.
Now, I don't know if you do much GMing, but if you were to run this yourself, what might you add or change about the scenario, or what would you watch out for if you were running it based on your playthrough?
Not a huge amount. I was wondering. We had one fairly intense battle, didn't we, at the barn before we had the final sort of confrontation, and it was a good battle in a sense that it was tense and you felt in danger of a sort of a character death. And I did think afterwards whether it needed, you see these sort of great films, these great books, they sort of build, don't they? You have sort of increasing conflict and increasing difficulty as you sort of try to overcome that sort of final battle goal, whatever you want to call it. And I was thinking whether there needed to be sort of almost another sort of battle or something else in between the barn fight and the final sort of confrontation. But whether that would have been a bit beyond the players. I mean, we got quite roughed up a little bit. One or two didn't they get in that battle? So I imagine, sort of reflecting on afterwards, that it was probably about right that you want to challenge, but you also want to feel that as you can influence the game. It was good mixture, as you say. You had some fights, stealth. There's a bit of role playing with the villagers. I don't think. So there's that linear element to it, but I don't think you can really do much about that in an introductory adventure. So no, there's not. I enjoyed it. I thought it was good. There's not a huge amount I would change, other than thinking whether might squeeze one more fight in. But equally, that might involve a character death or two fairly early on. So maybe not.
It's good for pushing the characters, but it has that kind of new RPG ethos where it feels like you can get pretty hit hard in a scene, but the next scene your characters are pretty much okay. I mean, they might pick up some injuries if they've really gone beyond what they can tolerate, but all the stress and stuff kind of disappears, and you're back there fighting it out. So I think with that you might be able to squeeze in another fight.
Yeah, and yeah, I mean I had a long break from RPG, and I mean, yeah, that's an element that is new to me, and as I've started playing again, and yeah, I'm sort of getting used to it. That you can sort of effectively have a breather or a restart, and that does enable you to squeeze more things in. So yeah, I'm still trying to sort of adjust to these new sort of changes and trends in games after my sort of lengthy RPG cryo sleep.
Is there anything else you'd like to add? Anything about cows, for example?
Yeah, I suppose the only thing maybe I was slightly disappointed in was the I thought there was an excessive amount of sort of cow deaths. Maybe they could tone that down in future adventures. But I suppose it was again part of. The cows could have been wielding machine guns and helping the villagers for all I don't know. That was. I felt for the cows.
And finally,
a quick trip to France worked beautifully as an exhilarating World War II romp with Cthulhu Mythos spice. My players and I definitely got a better grip with the system after playing it, which makes it a pretty decent introductory adventure for the system as well. If you like the larger-than-life approach with a little of the baggage of the horrors of existential dread or war troubling you, I recommend it heartily. I was unsure whether this would be a quick dip into this system or the start of something more regular. As it turned out, I was pretty keen to try the sequel, Operation Vanguard, with the same players and characters, which did leave me having to explain the explosive ending my players had engineered. But in the spirit of Saturday morning cartoons and pulp fantasy, that was no problem. Despite apparently being consumed in a great explosion at the end of the last episode, they all made it back home with just a few more sexy scars and a hell of a story to tell. And maybe someday, it's a story I will tell you. Thank you for listening to Run the Adventure with me, your host, Sid Razavi. I love to hear any feedback, questions, or your thoughts on this episode. You can reach me on email, gm@runtheadventure, all one word, .com, or find me on Twitter at RTA_podcast. If you liked what you heard, please do consider leaving a review or rating on iTunes, Spotify, Google Podcast, or wherever you found this pod. Even better, please share the pod with your friends and on social media. Links to today's adventure are available on the show notes and on the website www.runtheadventure.com. Until the next episode, may your adventure run fantastic.